Have you ever had that feeling, where the world around you just seems to be shifting, maybe subtly, in ways that are kind of hard to pin down, even in places you know well, like maybe your kid's school or just the news you read?
Yeah, it's a common sort of feeling, I think.
Exactly. And today, we're going to dive deep into one author's attempt to explain exactly that.
Today, our focus is squarely on Christopher S. Rufo's book, America's Cultural Revolution: How the Radical Left Conquered Everything.
Okay, and it's really important right up front to say we are exploring Rufo's specific argument here. It's often provocative. He's a journalist, an activist, and, well, in his own words, he broke the stories exposing critical race theory in America's institutions.
That's right. So our mission today is really to unpack his detailed story, his narrative of how he believes left-wing ideology moved from, say, the 1960s right up to today. He argues that even when the big visible protests faded, the spirit of the revolution carried on, maybe quieter, but in his view, equally dangerous, by strategically infiltrating key institutions. That's his core claim. And he argues this has led to really profound changes in American life, often, he says, without much public discussion or consent.
Got it. So we're presenting his viewpoint, his take on what he terms the critical theories and this new ideological regime.
Precisely.
Okay, so to really get where Rufo's coming from, he actually starts with something very personal, a story that he says was his own catalyst.
Right. He talks about his early days as a journalist in Seattle. He was reporting on the homelessness crisis there.
Okay.
And it was during that time, he writes, that activists started what he calls a relentless pressure campaign against him and his family.
And this wasn't just like online arguments.
No, not according to his account. He talks about efforts to damage reputations, attempts to get his wife fired, even publishing his home address, and putting up menacing posters near his son's elementary school. That sort of thing. Yeah. And he says this whole experience, he saw himself as a moderate. Before this, it radicalized him. It opened his eyes, he says, to the real nature of left-wing politics.
And then later, when he started looking into critical race theory,
he claims he discovered the same dynamic, but, playing out nationally.
So that's his personal starting point. But how does he trace the intellectual roots of this regime he talks about?
Well, he points quite strongly to figures like Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse was a key thinker in what's known as the Frankfurt School.
Right, the critical theory guys.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They developed critical theory, aiming to critique society, culture, often using Marxist ideas as a base, but taking them in new directions.
Okay.
Now, Marcuse, as Rufo lays out, was apparently quite disillusioned after the German Revolution of 1918 failed.
Oh, okay.
So he sort of retreated from practical politics, Rufo says, and dove into academic work to develop his critical theory of society. Rufo breaks this down into three parts. First, a really radical critique of existing society. Second, a method for, quote, altering society as a whole. And third, a kind of utopian spirit to guide where humanity should go.
And Marcuse is probably best known for that idea of repressive tolerance, right?
Yeah, that's probably his most famous or infamous concept. He argued that in a liberal society, the very act of tolerating dissent, especially radical dissent, could actually neutralize it.
How so?
By basically confining radicals to just talk, just discussion, making them harmless and helpless, as Rufo puts it, quoting Marcuse. Genuine opposition gets sort of absorbed and defanged by the system's tolerance.
Interesting. And Rufo also highlights Marcuse's idea for a dictatorship of the intellectuals. That sounds striking.
It is. Rufo contends Marcuse actually proposed this group should lead society from slavery to freedom, which is, a big shift from the classic Marxist idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat, the working class.
So intellectuals leading the way instead of workers.
That's the idea Rufo presents. And he stresses these weren't just like dusty academic debates.
Right. He connects them to action.
Yeah, he argues Marcuse's theories were put into practice by groups like the Weather Underground. Their leader, Bernardine Dohrn, apparently saw Marcuse as a guiding light.
And they were involved in bombings?
Yes. Rufo cites the 1970 bombing of the NYPD headquarters as an example.
Yeah.
And their declaration afterwards, political power grows out of a gun, a Molotov, a riot, a commune. Very direct.
He also includes some pretty disturbing details, doesn't he, about a war council?
He does. He mentions claims from an FBI informant about a 1969 meeting in Flint, Michigan. At this meeting, Rufo writes, Dohrn allegedly celebrated Charles Manson.
Seriously?
That's the claim. And that leaders supposedly discussed eliminating, get this, 25 million people in re-education centers if they ever overthrew the government.
That's quite a claim.
It is. Then Rufo brings in Angela Davis. In his view, she followed the Black liberation line to its grim conclusions.
Okay, tell us about his portrayal of Davis.
He recounts her early life, facing racial hatred, violence in Birmingham. And he argues this pushed her to reject what he terms the Booker T. Washington syndrome,
Which he defines
as emphasizing individual effort, self-help, as the main path for Black progress instead of focusing on systemic change. Rufo notes she studied with Marcuse and famously declared, "Yes, I am a communist." He argues she used the resulting controversy to paint herself as a victim of state repression.
And the Marin County incident.
Right, the courthouse siege. Rufo details how guns used by Jonathan Jackson in that deadly event were traced back to Davis. He emphasizes her statement, "liberation by any means necessary," linking it, in his view, to justifying such violence.
Okay, so these were the more, let's say, overt confrontational actions of the 60s and 70s, but Rufo argues the movement didn't just disappear when that died down.
No, exactly. He contends that the most sophisticated activists and intellectuals of that new left started a new strategy. He calls it the long march through the institutions.
A long march. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It meant, he argues, moving the revolution off the streets and into places like universities, government, media, the core institutions of society.
So infiltrating from within, essentially.
That's the argument. He points to former Weather Underground members, people like Bernadine Dorn ending up at Northwestern, Bill Ayers at the University of Illinois, Kathy Boudin at Columbia, all securing professorships.
Is that common?
Rufo claims that approximately half of the most active weathermen managed to secure positions in the education field. And his point is, they didn't just teach, they actively worked to shift the university culture.
Oh.
By, as he puts it, legitimizing their ideas in sympathetic journals, purging reactionaries from the faculty, and recruiting cohorts of graduate students who share their views.
And the effect, according to Rufo.
Profound. He argues these new disciplines have cannibalized every traditional field in the humanities and social sciences, and that the campus mood reflects Marcuse's intolerance against movements from the right, leading to conservative faculty, as Rufo states, reporting feelings of hostility, fear, exclusion, and intimidation.
Now, how does this connect to something like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? Rufo ties that in, right?
He does, quite directly. He mentions Marcuse's wife, Ricky Schurover Marcuse, who theorized about training programs that could, quote, transform people's subconscious attitudes and push political liberation.
And DEI is the modern form of that.
In Rufo's view, yes. He calls DEI a stroke of genius because it sounds neutral, positive even, but he argues it actually installs left-wing orthodoxy and is used to suppress dissent through punishing what are called biases incidents.
He also talks about administrative bloat in universities, doesn't he?
Yes, significant bloat. He cites figures suggesting over 500,000 administrators were added between 1987 and 2012. That growth, he says, massively outpaced student and professor growth, and he attributes a lot of it directly to diversity initiatives.
Does he give specific examples of DEI in action?
He does. He uses the University of Pittsburgh, claiming they implemented racial quotas for admissions, had segregated affinity groups, mandated anti-racism training, and required diversity statements for leadership roles.
Diversity statements?
Yeah. See, the statements where Rufo claims applicants essentially had to confess their own role in the systematic way in which people are oppressed.
How did faculty react to this, according to his book? Did anyone push back?
He highlights some dissenting voices, like Michael Van Ukoff at Pitt, who apparently called DEI neo-Marxian political propaganda and compared to Soviet propaganda. And Abigail Thompson at UC Davis, who, Rufo notes, likened mandatory diversity statements to the loyalty oaths required during the Red Scare in the 1950s.
Okay, so that's academia. What about the media? He talks about a long march there, too.
Yes, and he sees its culmination as, quote, the conquest of the New York Times.
The New York Times? How so?
He argues that the Times, which he says once ridiculed Marcuse, has now had its linguistic universe basically taken over by the vocabulary of these critical theories.
He gives data on that, right? Specific words.
He does. Based on his analysis, he claims that between 2011 and 2019, the Times dramatically increased its use of terms like racist up 700%, racism up 1,000%, white privilege up 1,200%, and systemic racism up 1,000%.
Those are big jumps.
Huge jumps. And Rufo's argument is that the Times, being the guardian of the liberal consensus, managed to do what earlier radical groups couldn't.
Which was?
To persuade millions of Americans that the United States is a white supremacist nation. That's his claim about the Times' influence.
Okay, so universities, media. The next phase of this long march, according to Rufo, targets government itself.
Exactly. The state. With, millions of employees, vast budgets. Rufo calls it the ultimate mechanism for activists to shape society.
And he points to political leanings within government agencies.
Yeah, he finds it significant, claims federal departments lean heavily left. He cites 2020 donation data showing 84% of presidential campaign donations from non-defense federal employees went to Democrats.
And connects this to policy.
Directly. He details how the Biden administration mandated DEI across every department of the federal government. This led, he argues, to agencies rolling out programs that condemned the United States as systemically racist and interrogated employees for their whiteness.
He has a specific example for that too, doesn't he?
Yes, Sandia National Laboratories. He claims white male employees there were asked to write apology letters for their whiteness and commit to being a better ally.
And for Rufo, seeing figures like Janetta Cole involved is significant.
Extremely significant. He describes her as a Marxist scholar activist, notes her past leadership in communist-supported groups, and sees her now promoting her ideology as an official government contractor as proof that the Long March had been completed within the state itself.
Okay, so the next big institution, corporations. This seems like a contradiction, right? Critical theories often critique capitalism.
It does seem like one. Rufo calls it an insuperable contradiction. Yet he states flatly, every one of the Fortune 100 corporations has submitted to the ideology of the critical theories, usually packaged as DEI.
So why would they do that, in his view? What's the motivation?
He suggests a couple of things. One, it's like an insurance policy protection against activist campaigns, boycotts, and potentially costly discrimination lawsuits, even if frivolous.
Ah, okay. Risk management.
Sort of. And also, he claims, it involves directing donations to left-wing activist groups, which he describes as basically protection payments.
He points to the corporate response after George Floyd's death.
Yes, very much so. He notes the top 50 companies quickly pledged around $50 billion towards racial equity. CEOs publicly saying Black Lives Matter, some even kneeling in protest.
So for corporations, adopting DEI is like paying dues.
That's Rufo's analogy. He compares it to a tax, like businesses used to pay off the mob or powerful unions. Only now it's paid to the equity consulting firm and the racial activist organization.
And he argues these demands never end.
Right. He claims the theories can never be satisfied, so it leads to an endless inquisition. What starts as a temporary initiative often becomes a permanent department.
Does he have a surprising corporate example?
Yeah, he singles out Walmart. Based in, deep red Bentonville, Arkansas. He says even Walmart pledged $100 million to fight systemic racism and rolled out mandatory training that, in his words, denounces the United States as a racist society.
So his overall conclusion for this long march through institutions...
It's pretty bleak from his perspective. He sees it resulting in the extension of bureaucratic power and creating a new one-dimensional society where liberation becomes the pretext for domination and ultimately the counterculture becomes the establishment.
Okay, let's just focus slightly. Rufo dedicates a lot of attention to education, framing it as a key battleground. He talks about Paulo Freire.
Yes, Freire is presented as a major influence. Rufo describes Freire's educational philosophy as aiming to break down societal myths and spark revolutionary consciousness. He notes Freire's texts cite figures like Lenin, Mao, and Castro.
And Freire saw the classroom as the starting point for revolution.
That's Rufo's interpretation. He quotes Freire as believing the revolution might begin in the classroom, but it would end in the streets.
Does Rufo offer any examples of Freire's methods in practice?
He brings up a literacy campaign Freire led in Guinea-Bissau, which Rufo says was modeled on the Chinese Cultural Revolution.
And the outcome?
According to Rufo, not good. He describes Guinea-Bissau today as a failed state, high illiteracy, deep poverty, which leads Rufo to conclude that Freire's theories have never resulted in the meaningful improvement of practical skills, like basic literacy or numeracy.
So moving from Freire to how these ideas apply more broadly in schools today, Rufo talks about critical pedagogies. What does he mean by that?
He argues these pedagogies apply ruthless politics right down to the individual human spirit. And crucially, the main dividing line isn't class anymore, like in old Marxism, but racial identity, oppressor versus oppressed based on race.
This leads him to discuss the pedagogy of whiteness. What is that, according to him?
It's described as taking white identity and turning it into this category, whiteness, which is then, in his view, loaded up with negative meanings. He quotes Barbara Applebaum, a scholar in this field, who argues, essentially, that all whites, because of systemic privilege, are involved in perpetuating racial injustice. Which means, Rufo interprets, all whites are racist, no matter what they personally do or believe.
That's a strong claim. Does he connect it to other thinkers?
Yes, Noel Ignatieff and his theory of white skin privilege. Ignatieff argued, according to Rufo, that capitalists gave white workers small advantages to keep them divided from minorities, preventing a unified socialist revolution.
And Ignatieff called for,
famously or infamously, for whites to commit race suicide, which Rufo interprets not necessarily as literal death, but abandoning whiteness as an identity. He gives an example from a New York City school.
Which one?
Eastside Community School. He claims the principal there urged white parents to become white traitors and support white abolition, even providing 8 stages of white identity development for them to follow.
Wow. Okay, so if that's the pedagogy of whiteness, what about the pedagogy of blackness he describes?
He argues this teaches minority students to see everything through the lens of critical pedagogy. It establishes a narrative, he says, where the U.S. is fundamentally set up to oppress minorities systemically.
Does he provide school examples for this too?
Yes, quite stark ones from Buffalo Public Schools. He claims kindergartners were asked to compare skin tones to crayons and shown videos of dead black children as a warning about racist police.
In kindergarten?
That's the claim. And by high school, he says, the curriculum teaches that all white people play a part in perpetuating systemic racism.
He also mentions a specific curriculum tied to Black Lives Matter.
Yes, an unapologetically black curriculum in Buffalo that, according to Rufo, promotes 14 principles. These include things like disrupting Western nuclear family dynamics, dismantling white supremacy, and challenging cisgender privilege.
Cisgender privilege meaning?
The societal assumption that everyone identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. He also notes this curriculum imagines replacing the Western justice system, which it calls retributive, with an African-inspired restorative system.
And what would that entail?
Prioritizing collective value over individual rights, prohibiting private property. Rufo describes it as a kind of primitive communism.
He also points to activism within teachers' unions.
Right. He cites the school district of Philadelphia, where he says a union video explicitly called the U.S. a settler colony built on white supremacy and capitalism.
So with all this focus and funding, he mentions over $30,000 per child in places like Buffalo and Philly.
Yeah, higher than many wealthy European countries.
What are the educational outcomes, according to Rufo?
He states bluntly that in these districts, the majority of children remain functionally illiterate and innumerate, unable to read or do basic math effectively.
Okay, this leads to maybe his most jarring section, the Child Soldiers of Portland.
Yeah, it's a provocative title. He paints Portland, Oregon as a sort of headquarters of race radicalism where white guilt is almost like a civic religion.
And he focuses on youth involvement in protests.
Yes, specifically teenagers in the Youth Liberation Front during the 2020 riots. He describes them escalating rhetoric with chants like "Death to America" and engaging in violence. He even mentions seeing children as young as 3 chanting "Fuck the police."
And he argues schools are feeding into this.
He does. He claims Portland area schools created a school-to-radicalism pipeline, that they consciously pushed students in the direction of revolution, going so far as to say they were training child soldiers.
Does he offer any personal accounts to back this up?
He shares the story of an Iranian immigrant mother in Beaverton, Oregon. She apparently discovered her 3rd grader's curriculum focused on revolution, resistance, and liberation.
And this reminded her of Iran.
Yes, she said it felt like the political indoctrination she'd fled, right down to chanting "Death to America." She worried, Rufo writes, that it would turn child against parent and ultimately lead to bone-breaking tyranny.
So taking all this together, we get to what Rufo sees as the end game. He talks about abolition.
Right. And he argues the idea of abolition has really expanded. It's not just about prisons anymore. It now includes calls to dismantle traditional schools, immigration enforcement, even abstract concepts like rationality, whiteness, and capitalism.
He quotes specific advocates for this.
Yes, Bettina Love, who promotes abolitionist education. Rufo quotes her calling America a super predator and telling white teachers they need to basically relinquish authority to dark folks and reject whiteness for the good of humanity.
And her reasoning.
According to Rufo, her view is, if a group has been oppressed for 400 years, you'd want to start over. that this world simply wasn't set up for people of color, so we need to tear it down.
He links this agenda back to historical groups, too.
Yes, he sees strong parallels between Black Lives Matter's agenda and the Black Panther Party's 10-point program from decades ago, which also demanded things like financial restitution, land redistribution, and political self-determination.
Okay, let's talk about critical race theory, CRT itself. Rufo sees it spread as tactically clever.
He does. He describes it almost like a mousetrap. It uses, he claims, the epistemology of the oppressed, the idea that lived experience of oppression gives special insight, to justify his claims based on identity rather than, say, traditional reason, evidence, or rationality.
How does he see it reinterpreting history?
He argues CRT can frame events like the Emancipation Proclamation not as liberation, but as a kind of racial conspiracy to subordinate blacks in new ways, and that it uses guilt and shame to push opponents into accepting its conclusions.
Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality fits in here.
Centrally, Rufo explains it as expanding that basic oppressor-oppressed binary into a much more complex, multivariate hierarchy of oppression, where different identities, race, gender, class, etc., intersect. He argues this is used not to promote universal values, but specifically to gain left-wing political power.
He also discusses Derek Bell and racial pessimism.
Right. Bell's theory, as Rufo presents it, was that even supposedly colorblind institutions always find ways to subtly maintain white domination.
And Bell's space trader story.
Rufo cites it as a key example, calling it a book-length fantasy of white depravity. In the story, aliens offer solutions to America's problems in exchange for its entire black population, and 70% of white Americans vote yes. Then there's Cheryl Harris's idea of whiteness as property.
What's that about?
Rufo explains her argument is that whiteness itself functions like property, conferring advantages. Therefore, property rights are inherently tied to white supremacy and become legitimate targets for racialist reconquest, basically reclaiming resources based on race and even potentially South Africa-style wealth seizures.
And finally, Ibram X. Kendi's proposal.
Kendi proposed a federal department of anti-racism. Rufo interprets this as essentially creating a fourth branch of government, one that's unaccountable to voters.
With the power to do what?
With the power, Rufo claims Kendi envisions to veto or suspend any law, policy, or even idea deemed racist, a huge amount of power.
So how does Rufo wrap all this up? What's his final assessment?
He argues that these critical theories operate by pure negation. They tear down, but don't build up, leaving society, in his words, in permanent disintegration.
Does he offer a way to judge the results?
He poses a very simple test. Are conditions improving or not improving? Are cities safer or less safe? Are students learning to read or not learning to read? His implication is clearly that the answer is no.
And the book ends with a call to action.
Yes, a direct call for a counter-revolution. But he frames it not as class versus class, but as between the citizen and the ideological regime.
And the goal of this counter-revolution?
As Rufo lays it out, to reestablish the basic human desires, redraw moral boundaries, rebuild structures for human meaning. Practically, he says, by laying siege to the institutions that have lost the public trust and promoting alternatives, excellence over diversity, equality over equity, dignity over inclusion, order over chaos.
So, quite a journey through America's cultural revolution, its origins, its spread through institutions, and its ultimate impact.
Absolutely. And understanding these concepts, as presented by Rufo, gives you one specific lens, one framework for making sense of some current debates and trends you might see in education, the media, corporate policies, you name it.
Right. It's his interpretation, his narrative, and the book really leaves you with a final thought to chew on, doesn't it? It asks you to consider if what he calls a war of negation has taken hold in our institutions, then what kind of new foundations might be needed? How do you rebuild a society where those internal principles of freedom and equality can actually mean something tangible again for everyone?